When a loudmouth customer slapped an elderly woman inside a small-town diner, everyone froze. But what no one knew was that her son was watching. And he wasn't just any man. The bell above the door jingled softly as another customer walked into Evelyn's Corner Diner, a small, friendly spot tucked off Jefferson Avenue in Toledo, Ohio. The place had been around for decades, and everyone who came in knew the rules. Respect the staff, mind your tone, and never talk bad about the pancakes. Inside, the smell of butter and maple syrup floated in the air. The coffee machines hissed in rhythm, plates clinked gently on tables, and the sound of old blues music played low in the background. It was the kind of morning where nothing special needed to happen. People came there to escape the noise of the outside world. Clara Jennings, 72 years old, sat at her usual booth near the window, the one with the view of the corner streetlight and the little park across the road. She wore a light gray cardigan and her favorite pearl earrings, the ones her late husband had given her on their 25th anniversary. Every Tuesday morning, without fail, she came here for two things: the pancakes and the peace. The waitress, a young woman named Tina, stopped by with her order: scrambled eggs, buttered pancakes, and black coffee. "Morning, Miss Clara," she said, smiling warmly. "Morning, sweetheart," Clara replied. "How's that baby boy of yours doing?" "Still keeping me up at night," Tina laughed, rolling her eyes. "But I wouldn't trade him for the world." Clara chuckled. "You'll miss those nights one day." They grow up fast. Too fast. The two women shared a moment of quiet understanding, one from experience, the other still learning what motherhood meant. At the counter, an older man named Harold was reading the newspaper aloud to anyone who would listen. He did it every morning, half to share the news, half to feel like the old days when folks actually talked to each other. "Gas prices going up again," he muttered. "I tell you, they never go down for long." A few regulars groaned in agreement, while the cook behind the counter shouted back, "That's why I drive a bike." The diner laughed. That's what made the place special. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like family. Everyone had their seat, their routine, their story. Clara smiled, turning the page of her newspaper, circling the crossword like she always did. The morning sun glowed across her table, lighting up her silver hair. Everything about that moment felt safe, predictable, ordinary. But things that start peaceful often change the fastest. The doorbell jingled again. Only this time, it wasn't another friendly face. A man in his late 30s walked in, tall and broad-shouldered, his presence immediately changing the air in the room. His name was Rick Dawson. He wasn't from the neighborhood. Everyone could tell. Expensive leather jacket, loud voice, that kind of arrogance you could hear before he even opened his mouth. He didn't wait to be seated. He just marched straight to a booth, dropped himself down, and snapped his fingers at the waitress. "Hey, sweetheart, how about a menu, huh?" he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. Tina froze for half a second, forcing a polite smile. "Of course, sir." She handed him the menu and hurried back behind the counter. Harold looked up from his paper, eyeing Rick carefully. The regulars didn't say a word, but they all felt it. The kind of tension that comes when someone walks into your space and doesn't respect it. Clara, always the gentle soul, tried to ignore the noise. She focused on her crossword puzzle, sipping her coffee. She'd seen people like him before, the kind who confuse volume with strength. Rick grumbled under his breath about the prices, the slow service, even the music. "Who still listens to this old junk?" he said loudly, shaking his head. No one answered. That was how people handled trouble in small places. Silence. But silence has power. It can either cool things down or make someone like Rick even louder. He leaned back in his seat, sighing dramatically, tapping his fingers against the table. The diner's peace was gone. Even the cook had stopped humming. Clara looked up for a brief moment, studying the man. She didn't say a word, just a small, quiet look of disapproval. The kind a teacher gives when she knows someone can do better. That small glance was all it took. Rick noticed, and something in his expression shifted. But what no one knew yet was that this single look, this quiet morning, was about to turn into a day the whole diner would remember forever. Rick slouched in the booth, his arms stretched across the backrest like he owned the place. The other customers tried to focus on their breakfast, pretending not to see him, but everyone felt his presence. His voice cut through the calm like a siren in the night. Tina came back with her notepad, forcing a polite smile. "What can I get you today, sir?" He looked up at her with a smirk. Finally. Thought I was invisible for a second. She swallowed hard, but kept her tone even. We've been a little busy this morning. Would you like coffee while you look over the menu? He waved a hand dismissively. Just get me bacon, eggs, toast, and make sure the eggs aren't like rubber this time. Tina hesitated. He hadn't even been there before. Yes, sir, she said softly, then turned away. At the counter, Harold whispered to another regular, That guy's trouble. You can smell it. The other man nodded quietly, not wanting to be overheard. Clara kept her head down, tracing her crossword with the end of her pen. But every word she heard from that man took a little more peace out of her morning. Rick leaned over his table, pulling out his phone. Loud rap music started blasting from the speaker. The cook behind the counter shouted, Hey buddy, we don't play music in here. Rick shot him a glare. It's a free country, old man. The whole diner froze. Even the jukebox stopped mid-song when someone quietly switched it off. Tina came back with his coffee, setting it down gently. Sir, we have other customers. He cut her off. Relax, I'm just passing time. He took a sip, made a face, and spat the coffee right back into the cup. What is this, mud water? You people charge $3 for this trash? The cook took a deep breath, gripping the counter like he was holding himself back. Harold muttered under his breath. One of these days. Clara finally looked up. Her voice, calm and firm, carried through the silence. Young man, she said softly, there's no reason to talk that way. That girl is just doing her job. Rick turned toward her, eyebrows raised. Excuse me? Clara didn't flinch. You heard me. You could use your words with a little more respect. For a moment, Rick seemed almost confused. Then that smirk returned. Lady, I didn't ask for advice, all right? Drink your coffee and mind your own business. The air grew heavy. Tina stood frozen near the counter. Harold turned his eyes back to his paper, though everyone was listening. Clara took a slow sip of coffee, eyes never leaving him. That's exactly what I was doing, until you made it everyone's business. That response landed like a small hammer. Rick laughed once, loud and sharp, trying to cover his embarrassment. You think you're tough for an old lady, huh? Clara didn't answer. She simply turned back to her crossword. That silence, that quiet confidence, bothered him more than any insult could have. He muttered something under his breath and started drumming his fingers again. Tina placed his plate down on the table a few minutes later, careful not to make eye contact. He poked at his eggs, rolled his eyes, and sighed loudly. Unbelievable. Even this is wrong. What are they teaching people these days? Clara had finished her breakfast by then and reached for her cup of coffee, but as she lifted it, her hand bumped the edge of his plate, and a few drops of coffee spilled near his toast. Ah, I'm so sorry, she said immediately, reaching for a napkin. Rick's eyes snapped to the spot. His voice rose. Are you kidding me? She tried to clean it up, but before anyone could stop him, Rick slammed his hand down on the table. You old bat! Watch what you're doing! The diner went still. Tina gasped. Harold started to stand up, but before he could say anything, Rick slapped her. The sound echoed through the entire diner. Clara's hand froze halfway to her cheek. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just sat there, eyes wide, the disbelief hitting her harder than the slap itself. Tina whispered, Oh my God! Rick's breath was heavy, his face twisted in anger. But as the silence stretched, it was clear even he didn't know what to do next. He'd gone too far. Clara slowly turned her face toward him, one hand against her cheek. Her voice trembled, but her words were steady. You should be ashamed of yourself. No one moved. No one spoke. Harold finally muttered, Somebody call the police. Rick barked, Don't you dare! But before he could finish, the sound of a car engine outside caught everyone's attention. A black SUV pulled up right in front of the diner. The engine cut off, and the door opened. A tall man stepped out. Sharp suit, calm face, steady walk. He wasn't rushing, but his presence drew every eye in the diner. Tina whispered under her breath, Who is that? Clara's lips parted slightly. She knew that walk. It was her son. But what none of them knew yet was that this quiet man carried a name whispered in corners, a name people respected and feared. The black SUV sat outside the diner, engines still ticking from the drive. Its glossy paint reflected the morning light and the stares of everyone inside. For a second, no one said a word. Rick shifted uneasily in his seat, his hands still resting on the table, unsure what to do. Clara's eyes didn't leave the door. Something about the presence of that car brought back a calm that hadn't been there a moment ago. The door opened and a man stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, early 40s, wearing a dark gray suit and no tie. His name was Maurice Jennings. Most folks in Toledo knew him only vaguely, a quiet businessman who kept to himself. But those who really knew better. Maurice wasn't a man of noise. He was a man of presence. He walked into the diner, his shoes clicking softly on the floor. The bell above the door gave a short, sharp ring, and every conversation that might have started died before it began. He scanned the room once. He didn't need to ask who. The sight of his mother's reddened cheek told him everything. He walked straight to her booth, his expression calm but unreadable. "Mom," he said quietly. Clara looked up, trying to smile. "Morris, I didn't want you to see me like this." He crouched beside her, his hand gently brushing the side of her face, turning it slightly toward the light. "Who did it?" Her voice trembled. "It's nothing. Please, just sit with me. Forget it happened." He didn't look away. "Mom, who did this?" The question wasn't loud, but it cut through the diner like a knife. Rick shifted again, clearing his throat. "Hey, hold on a second." Maurice stood up slowly, turning toward him. "You?" Rick blinked, trying to find his footing. "Look, man, it was an accident. She spilled coffee on me, all right? I didn't mean..." Maurice's gaze stayed locked on him. "You didn't mean to raise your hand?" Rick tried to laugh, but the sound came out thin. "You're overreacting." Tina, from behind the counter, whispered to another waitress. "He's her son." "I've seen him before. Owns some warehouse business over on Monroe Street." The cook, still standing with his arms crossed, muttered, "That ain't no warehouse business." Maurice stepped closer to Rick's booth, but his tone never changed. Calm, controlled. "What's your name?" "Why?" Rick snapped. "Because I'd like to know what kind of man thinks it's okay to hit a 70-year-old woman," Maurice said. The whole diner held its breath. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick quieter. Rick swallowed hard. "You're making this a bigger deal than it needs to be." "She'll be fine." Maurice tilted his head slightly. "You're right. She'll be fine." He looked around the diner, at Tina, Harold, the other regulars, all frozen in disbelief. Then his eyes came back to Rick. "But you won't be." Rick's jaw tightened, but there was no fight left in his voice. He was trapped, not by force, but by presence. Two men sitting near the back booth stood up quietly. They wore plain clothes, but their posture said everything. They weren't there for breakfast. Maurice didn't even look at them. He didn't have to. His attention stayed on Rick. "You know," Maurice said softly, "my mother spent 35 years teaching kids how to read, how to listen, how to control themselves. If you'd had a teacher like her, maybe we wouldn't be here." Rick's face flushed. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Maurice smiled faintly, but it wasn't the kind of smile you'd want to see. "No, I just think men who hit women shouldn't be comfortable anywhere. Not even in a diner." Harold leaned toward the man beside him, whispering, "He's not yelling." "That's worse." Tina stepped forward cautiously. "Maurice, please. Let's not make this worse." He turned his head slowly toward her, his expression softening. "You're right. Nobody here deserves to see that kind of thing. Call the police. Tell them a man assaulted my mother." Rick stood up abruptly. "Hey, wait, that's not..." Maurice raised a hand, not to hit, just to silence him. "You've said enough." The diner went silent again. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window slightly, as if even the air was waiting to see what would happen next. Clara's voice, soft and weary, broke the quiet. "Maurice, please, just take me home." He nodded gently and helped her up, keeping his arm steady around her shoulders. His voice lowered, calm again. "You deserve better than this place right now." She hesitated, looking around at the faces watching. "They don't deserve to see this either," she said quietly. Maurice gave a small nod. "You're right, Mom." He looked at Rick one last time, and for a brief second, the mask slipped. Not into anger, but something colder. "Don't move." He turned toward Tina, Police are on their way, right? She nodded shakily. Yes, sir. He gave her a short nod and led his mother toward the door. The bell rang again as they stepped out, the diner filled with the low rumble of conversation starting back up, uncertain and hushed. Rick slumped into his seat, sweat beading on his forehead. Everyone was still looking at him, not in fear, but in disappointment. He muttered, "You all saw it." She bumped into me. I didn't. But no one wanted to hear him anymore. And outside, as the SUV door closed, Maurice made a quiet call, one that would make sure respect found its way back to the diner before the day was done. When Maurice walked back into Evelyn's corner diner 10 minutes later, the room was already on edge. The police hadn't arrived yet, and Rick was pacing by the window, muttering to himself. Every time the door creaked, he flinched. Maurice pushed the door open calmly. The bell jingled. That same sound, now sharp as a blade. Every eye in the diner turned toward him. He didn't rush, didn't raise his voice. He simply walked back to the same spot, the same booth where his mother had sat just minutes before. He placed both hands on the table, looked at Rick and said, "Sit down." Rick froze. "Man, I told you, it was an accident." Maurice didn't move an inch. "Sit down." Rick hesitated for a second, then sat. His voice cracked slightly. "I said I was sorry." Maurice leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. "No, you didn't." "You said it was an accident." That's not the same thing. Rick opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Maurice continued calm as ever. "You know what's funny? My mother raised me on rules. Not fancy rules, just simple ones. Don't steal, tell the truth, and never, ever disrespect people who've lived long enough to teach you something." Rick stared at him, trying to look defiant, but his eyes kept dropping to the table. Maurice tilted his head slightly. "Tell me, Rick, where were your rules when you hit her?" Rick stammered, I lost my temper, all right? She spilled coffee on me. Maurice's expression didn't change. "You think coffee burns worse than shame?" The question landed heavy. The room went still again. Even the clock on the wall seemed to stop ticking. At the counter, Harold whispered to Tina, "He's handling this better than I expected." Tina whispered back, "He doesn't need to yell." "That's what makes it worse." Maurice sat back slightly, hands folded, almost casual. "You know what happens when you forget respect, Rick?" Rick didn't answer. Maurice leaned in. "You lose it from everyone else. That's the tax for being careless with people." He turned to the rest of the diner, scanning the faces that had been frozen for the last 20 minutes. "How many of you have seen something like this before? Someone gets loud, mean, because they think they can, and the rest of us just sit there hoping it stops?" A few heads nodded quietly. Harold looked down at his paper, guilt flickering across his face. Maurice nodded slowly. "That's how it grows. Disrespect isn't born loud. It starts small, but it spreads when nobody says a thing." He turned back to Rick. "You embarrassed a woman old enough to be your mother. You made strangers watch it happen. And you think the word sorry fixes that?" Rick swallowed hard. "What do you want me to do, huh?" Maurice's voice softened, not with mercy, but clarity. "I want you to understand something you clearly missed growing up." He leaned closer. "Respect doesn't make you weak. It keeps you from being small." Rick's mouth trembled slightly, but he didn't respond. His bravado had collapsed. Maurice looked toward the manager. "The police?" The manager nodded. "On their way." "Should be here any minute." Maurice nodded once. "Good." He stood slowly, buttoning his jacket. "You'll have time to think before they get here. Use it wisely." He started to walk toward the door, but paused. "And Rick?" Rick looked up nervously. "Yeah?" "Apologize to my mother when you see her again. But don't do it for her. Do it because one day, someone might have to forgive you for something worse." Rick looked down, unable to meet his eyes. Maurice walked out, the bell above the door giving that same quiet ring. The sound of order being restored. Tina finally let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I thought he was going to snap," she whispered. Harold shook his head slowly. "Nah, that man doesn't need to snap. He just makes the world stand still until it listens." Outside, Maurice stood beside his SUV, looking through the diner's glass window for a moment. He saw Rick, hunched at the table, small and quiet now, no longer the loud man who'd walked in earlier. He took a deep breath, exhaled, and looked up at the sky. "Mom raised me right," he said under his breath, before getting into the car. But as he drove away, he couldn't shake one thought, that it shouldn't take someone like him for people to remember how to treat others right. When the door closed behind Maurice, the diner stayed quiet for a long moment. No one wanted to move first. The air was thick, not with tension this time, but with reflection. Rick sat in the same booth, his hands clasped together, his eyes on the floor. The man who'd walked in like a storm was now completely still. Tina approached carefully, still shaken. She placed a glass of water in front of him. "You should drink something." He didn't answer, just stared at the table, the untouched plate, the coffee cup he'd complained about earlier. The once loud, cocky voice was gone. Clara stepped back into the diner a few minutes later, her son having driven her around the block and back. She'd insisted, not out of pride, but because she wanted to leave things right. The bell chimed softly as she walked in, holding her small purse close. Every person in the diner turned toward her, not out of pity, but respect. She walked slowly, her steps measured, eyes steady. The mark on her cheek was faint now, but visible. It didn't define her. Her calm did. Rick looked up when he heard her footsteps. His throat went dry. "Ma'am, Clara stopped by his booth. "Don't call me ma'am," she said gently. "You're not talking to a stranger. You're talking to someone's mother." Rick blinked, guilt flooding his face. "I didn't mean to." She held up a hand. "You did. And you'll carry that with you. But maybe that's not the worst thing." He frowned slightly, confused. Clara pulled out the seat across from him and sat down. The whole diner watched, silent. Even Tina leaned against the counter, her eyes wide. Clara folded her hands on the table. "I taught school for 35 years. Kids who came from broken homes, rough neighborhoods, places where respect was something they had to learn the hard way." Rick said nothing. She continued. "Some of them learned. Some didn't. The ones who didn't, they always thought the world owed them patience for their anger. But it doesn't. The world remembers the harm you cause long after you forget it." Her voice was calm, but it carried power. The kind of power that doesn't need to be proven. It's just there. Rick looked down, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. "I don't know what you want me to say." Clara took a slow breath. "I don't need you to say anything. I just want you to remember this feeling, that quiet, that shame. It's what happens when people finally see themselves clearly." He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." She studied him for a long moment, searching his face. Then she gave a small nod. "Good. That's a start." The manager, standing near the back, spoke softly. "Police are on their way, Miss Jennings." "You sure you don't want to leave?" Clara shook her head. "No, I've spent my life teaching lessons. I can stay long enough for one more." She turned back to Rick. "You see, young man, anger is a strange thing. It tricks you into thinking you're powerful, but real power, that's control. That's knowing when to sit still, when to walk away." Rick's eyes glistened slightly, though he tried to hide it. Clara leaned closer. "The next time you feel that anger building, I hope you hear my voice. Not to scold you, but to remind you. You're better than the worst moment you've had, but only if you decide to be tot." The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan. Tina wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. Harold just nodded to himself, whispering, "That's a real teacher right there." Rick took a deep breath. I don't deserve your forgiveness." Clara looked at him kindly. "Forgiveness isn't about deserving. It's about not letting bitterness stay in your heart, mine or yours." For a brief second, Rick met her eyes. And in that look, something changed. The arrogance that had followed him in that morning was gone. What replaced it wasn't pride or fear, it was the beginning of understanding. Clara stood, adjusting her cardigan. "You'll have time to think about this. Make it mean something." As she turned to leave, the police car lights flashed through the window, blue and red reflections sliding across the diner walls. The officers entered quietly, speaking to the manager first. Rick didn't resist. He just stood up, placed his hands on the table and said, "I'll go." Before he walked out, he looked at Clara one more time. "Thank you," he said quietly. She didn't respond, just gave a faint nod. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any words. The door closed behind them. The diner exhaled as though it had been holding its breath all morning. Tina came over and hugged Clara gently. You didn't have to come back, she said. Clara smiled softly. I did. I needed him to hear something before life taught it to him the hard way. Harold, from his seat, said with a small grin, Remind me never to argue with you, Miss Jennings. She chuckled lightly, picking up her purse. You wouldn't last a minute. The room erupted in quiet laughter. Not the loud kind, but the healing kind. But as the laughter faded, Clara looked out the window where the police car drove away and whispered to herself, Respect. That's the one lesson we never stop needing to learn. Outside Evelyn's corner diner, the air was still. The morning rush had turned into late morning quiet. The streets that once buzzed with traffic now felt peaceful again, as if nothing had happened. But inside Maurice, something hadn't settled yet. He leaned against the SUV, hands in his pockets, watching through the diner window as the officers led Rick away. His jaw wasn't clenched, but his eyes said everything. Anger mixed with disappointment. Not at what happened, but at the world that allowed it. The door opened and Clara stepped out. The soft ring of the bell behind her was the only sound between them. Maurice straightened immediately. You okay, Mom? She gave a tired smile. I've been through worse, son. Don't you worry about me. He looked at her cheek again, the faint redness that still lingered. You shouldn't have to go through worse. Not at your age, not anywhere. Clara walked closer, her cane tapping softly on the pavement. Maurice, you can't protect me from everything. That's not your job. He sighed, looking down. It's my job to try. For a moment, neither spoke. Cars passed in the distance. The scent of bacon still hung faintly in the air. Clara looked up at her son, her proud, quiet son who had seen more than most people could handle. You know, she said, when you were a boy, you used to come home with scraped knees from those kids down the block. You never told me who did it. You'd just say, It's fine, Mom. They learned. Maurice smiled faintly. Guess I haven't changed much. She chuckled softly. You haven't. But life isn't always about teaching lessons. Sometimes it's about showing restraint, letting others learn their own way. He turned to face her fully. You really think he learned anything? She nodded slowly. Yes. Not because of what you did, but because of what you didn't. Maurice tilted his head slightly. What I didn't? You could have done worse, she said simply. You've got power, son. The kind that doesn't need fists or guns. The kind that lives in your silence. And that man felt it. But what he'll remember most is that you chose to walk away. Her words sank in deep. Maurice had spent years building his name on control, on quiet power. But hearing it from her, it felt different. It wasn't about reputation anymore. It was about legacy. He exhaled slowly. You know, Mom, people respect you because you're kind. They respect me because they're scared. Clara reached out and placed a hand on his arm. Then maybe it's time they see that kindness and strength aren't opposites. You can be both. He looked at her hand, then at her face. That same look she used to give him when he was a boy caught doing something wrong. You sound like Dad, he said, half smiling. Your father believed in balance, she said softly. He used to say, the loudest man in the room usually has the least to say. You've learned that lesson well. But don't forget, silence has its place too. It can heal, or it can harden. Maurice looked toward the diner again. You think people in there will ever look at me the same way? They'll look at you the way they always should have, she said, like a man who knows right from wrong, and chose right. He took a deep breath and nodded. Maybe that's enough. She smiled gently. It always has been. They stood there for a moment, the quiet between them finally comfortable again. Then Clara touched his sleeve lightly. Take me home. I think I've taught enough lessons for one morning. Maurice opened the passenger door for her, steadying her as she climbed in. Before getting behind the wheel, he looked back at the diner. Inside, Tina and Harold were cleaning up the tables, moving slowly, still processing what they'd witnessed. He thought about how small moments, a slap, a word, a reaction, could ripple through an entire room. As he started the car, Clara spoke softly. You did good today. Maurice glanced at her. Didn't feel like it. Good doesn't always feel good, she said. Sometimes it just feels necessary. He gave a quiet nod, eyes fixed on the road ahead. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the city rolling by. The morning light shimmered through the windshield, washing away the harshness of earlier hours. After a while, Clara spoke again. "Morris?" "Yeah, Mom?" "Promise me something." "Anything." She looked out the window. "Promise me you'll never let anger decide for you. Not even when you're right." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I promise." And for the first time that morning, a small peace returned to both of them. But peace doesn't last forever. It waits. And sometimes, it waits just long enough to remind you of what really matters when the world tests your patience again. Inside Evelyn's Corner Diner, time seemed to move differently after Clara and Maurice left. The air felt heavier, not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. The kind of quiet that settles after something important happens. Tina wiped down the counter, her hands moving slow. She kept glancing at the door, as if expecting Clara to walk back in again. Harold folded his newspaper neatly, something he never did, and said, "You know, I've been coming here for 20 years. I've seen people argue about everything, politics, baseball, who makes the best pie. But I've never seen a man like that come in here and not cause trouble." The younger man sitting next to him, Jamal, one of the local mechanics, nodded. He didn't even raise his voice. "That's what got me. Just stood there, calm as anything, and you could feel the whole place freeze." Tina sighed softly. "I thought he was going to hit that man." "Honestly, I was scared." Harold chuckled dryly. "No, he didn't need to. Some people have a way of reminding you how small you really are, without ever laying a hand." The cook, wiping his hands on a towel, joined in. "Yeah, but that old lady, though, Miss Jennings, she's tougher than anyone I've seen. She came back in here just to talk to that guy." Tina smiled faintly. "She taught half this neighborhood. I heard she even tutored kids who couldn't afford school help. Always said, every child can change if someone believes they can." The manager, who had been silent all morning, finally spoke. "She didn't just talk to him. She forgave him. That's something I couldn't have done." The group fell quiet again. Jamal leaned on his elbows. "You think he meant it? The apology?" Harold nodded slowly. "I think he did." You could see it on his face. That look a man gets when he realizes the world doesn't spin around him. Tina exhaled, staring down at her rag. "You know what got me? The way she said, 'You're talking to someone's mother.' That hit different. Made me think about mine." She glanced out the window. "Made me think about how I talk to people too." The cook shook his head. "Ain't it something? How one moment can change how you see everything." Harold smiled. "Yeah, that's life though. Most of the lessons worth learning don't come from books. They come from mistakes." The bell over the door rang softly. Everyone looked up. It wasn't Clara or Maurice this time, just a delivery man bringing in a box of supplies. He looked around at the quiet faces and asked, "Rough morning?" Tina gave a tired smile. "You could say that." The man shrugged. "Happens to the best of us." He left the box and headed out again, the bell ringing behind him. Harold chuckled under his breath. If he only knew. The manager started turning the radio back on, letting old blues music drift through the diner again. It wasn't as loud as before, but it was something. Tina leaned on the counter, staring at the reflection in the coffee pot. "You know what I realized? Respect ain't just about being polite. It's about seeing people. Really seeing them. The waitress, the teacher, the old man reading his paper. We forget that sometimes." Harold nodded. "Yeah, until someone reminds us the hard way." The cook pointed toward the booth where Clara had sat. "That woman, she walked out with her head high. She didn't let him take her piece. That's something right there." For a few seconds, the room went quiet again, everyone's eyes drifting toward that empty booth by the window. The sunlight poured across the table, catching the edge of her empty coffee cup that Tina hadn't yet cleared away. It sat there like a reminder. Not of the slap, not of the shouting, but of grace. Tina whispered, "I think I'll leave that cup there till the end of my shift." The manager nodded softly. "Leave it. Some seats deserve to rest a while." Outside, traffic picked up again. A bus stopped at the corner. A woman laughed on her phone as she crossed the street. The world was moving again. Harold unfolded his paper again, but didn't start reading. Instead, he said, "You think she'll come back next Tuesday?" Tina smiled, eyes soft. "She always does." The cook added, "And if she does, breakfast's on me." Everyone chuckled, the tension finally starting to fade into something lighter. Tina looked toward the door one last time. "That woman, she reminded me that it's never too late to act right, or to learn." Harold nodded. "Amen to that." But even as life went back to normal, nobody who sat in that diner that morning would ever forget what they'd seen, or the quiet power of a woman who taught an entire room what respect truly means. The world outside kept moving. Cars passing, people laughing, a city alive with its usual rhythm. But for the few who had sat inside Evelyn's corner diner that morning, something had changed forever. Sometimes lessons don't arrive in classrooms or sermons. Sometimes they show up in the middle of breakfast, in the form of a mistake that forces everyone to stop and look at themselves. That morning had started like any other. Coffee, pancakes, small talk, until one man's pride turned into cruelty. But what followed was something far more powerful than revenge. It was accountability. Maurice could have handled things differently. He had the kind of power that made people nervous. But he chose control. He chose restraint. And in that silence, he showed what real strength looks like. Not the kind that comes from fear, but the kind that comes from character. And Clara, she didn't let humiliation define her. She walked back into that diner not to shame, but to teach. Her grace spoke louder than any slap ever could. In a world where anger travels faster than thought, her patience was its own kind of rebellion. People like her remind us of something we forget too often. Respect isn't a gift. It's a choice. You don't have to like everyone you meet. You don't have to agree with every stranger or every word they say. But there's a line, a thin one, that separates decency from destruction. And once you cross it, you can't control what happens next. Clara didn't just defend herself that morning. She defended something bigger. The idea that dignity doesn't depend on how people treat you. It depends on how you choose to respond. And the truth is, we've all been Rick at some point. Maybe not with our hands, but with our words. Maybe in traffic, or at work, or with someone who didn't deserve our anger. We've all let pride speak for us once or twice. But here's the difference between those who grow and those who don't. The ones who grow learn to see the mirror in moments like these. They learn to listen to the part of themselves that whispers, "You could have done better." Because that whisper, if you let it, becomes your teacher. When the police drove off that day, and the diner went back to the sound of dishes clinking and quiet conversation, something stayed behind. It wasn't fear, it wasn't gossip, it was respect. Earned, not demanded, and it came from one woman who refused to let her pain turn into poison. Clara Jennings may never know how many people she changed that morning. She didn't need to. Her kind of influence doesn't live in headlines. It lives in the small corners of people's hearts, where they carry her lesson forward without even realizing it. The next time someone spoke harshly to Tina, she thought twice before reacting with anger. The next time Harold heard someone being rude, he spoke up instead of staying quiet. And even Rick, long after his name left the diner's memory, remembered that moment every time his temper started to rise. That's what real change looks like. Not in speeches, but in choices. Maybe the next time you're out, at a diner, a store, anywhere, and you see someone struggling, someone older, someone slower, someone trying their best, you'll remember Clara's voice. You're talking to someone's mother. Because every person carries a story you can't see, but still a history you don't know. And if you can't respect that, what are you really showing the world about yourself? At the end of the day, respect isn't complicated. It's not about power or status or fear. It's about remembering that the people around you are human, fragile, flawed, trying, and deserving of kindness, even on their worst days. Clara taught that lesson not with a speech, but with silence. And Maurice, her son, reminded us that real authority doesn't need to roar to be heard. It only needs to stand firm when it matters most. The world could use more of both. So the next time life tests your patience, take a breath, lower your voice, lead with dignity. You might be surprised how far that one act of control can go. And if this story moved you even a little, don't just keep it to yourself. Share it. Talk about it. Let it remind someone else that respect is the one thing we can give freely, and the one thing we should never take for granted. Because in the end, it's not about who's stronger. It's about who chooses to stay kind when strength is easy.